Advanced TV Herstory, the podcast that brings you fresh perspective on the importance of TV in our lives. We tell stories of leadership, persistence, and achievement of TV women, because in the lives of women, no other media platform has influenced or inspired so many. Lo, these 60 years. Women of all ages have been impacted by what they've seen and will see on TV. So join us for a little Advanced TV Herstory by streaming it directly on our website, tvherstory.com, or anywhere you find podcasts. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.
Hello, TV Herstoryans. Welcome to another installment of Advanced TV Herstory. And you're about to hear a voice that if you are a loyal listener and you've been listening off and on for 2 years to this podcast, you're going to hear pretty soon the voice of Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, who helped me work through 3 episodes of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. We talked about fashion. We talked about the writers. We talked about the fact that all of the women associated with that show were pioneers. They were the first in many cases to have the roles that they had. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong has gone on to write another book called Seinfeldia. We're going to talk just a little bit about that and how it is that all this book writing really contributes to the larger dialogue that we at TV Herstory feel is so important. Fans know a lot. Fans are totally aware of the impact that TV has on their lives. So Advanced TV Herstory, the podcast, wouldn't be where it is today without the good people like Jennifer, who take time out of their promo schedules to talk a little bit more about their books, but also to talk about TV and really why it is that someone can be a fan and ultimately end up writing these incredible books. So we are here today ultimately to talk about Sex and the City and us. And first and foremost, we're here to welcome Jennifer Keishin Armstrong. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. Welcome. So yeah, we talked 2 years ago. They were awesome episodes. If you haven't listened, please do so, because Jennifer's book is called Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted, right?
Correct.
Okay. So what have you been doing since Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted, Seinfeld? What was that all about and why did you pick it?
Yeah, I wrote a book about Seinfeld called Seinfeldia. And the reason that I chose that is there's actually very few shows that really, to me, live up to a book treatment. You know, you can love a lot of shows, but most of the shows that I love in the world don't necessarily lend themselves to 350 pages of story and analysis, you know, and people love to tell me, you know, like, oh, you should do this one next. And I love that people do that and feel that way. But most shows don't really live up to that. And I felt like Seinfeld, of all the shows in history, really did. And I almost felt like if I'm going to keep writing books about TV history, it seemed crazy not to do Seinfeld. You know, it was a big moment. And I think really was the transitional moment between kind of our old ways of watching television and our current ways of watching television. So that was why I chose it. Also, it just is one of those shows that lights people up. When you just say, I wrote a book about Seinfeld, they lose their minds immediately if they're into the show, and many people are into the show. So it was really fun to be out there talking to fans of the show and about why they love it so much for the last really, almost 2 years now since the book came out. It's been nonstop because people love Seinfeld so much.
So I guess as I'm kind of drawing some correlations, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Seinfeld, Sex and the City, these were all very stable ensemble casts. And they were very much time capsules of the time because they were so dialogue heavy and just, they were sitcoms, I guess. Although I guess you could almost, there were some dramatic moments in all of them, certainly. I don't know, that they were all very powerful, very powerful. And I can tell you, having done this podcast now for almost 3 years, to tackle Sex and the City, which I just consider to be this incredible, its legacy is so complex that I'm glad I held off. I'm glad that I never even attempted it. And then boom, found out that you had done this book, which I want to ask just a little bit more about why you are writing in this format and what you're finding from your publisher from your editor, the kind of enthusiasm that's out there for this level of storytelling and fact gathering?
It's actually been really interesting because I think it just turned out to be, I started writing these books several years ago now, and probably about 5 or 6, really the actual writing 7 years ago. And the way we regard television has changed during that time. I was kind of at the beginning of that idea where we started to take it seriously. And books take a little time to catch up. The book industry, they want to see that something works first. So when I was first doing it, when I did Mary and Lou, no one was sure what this was or if it was going to work in terms of telling these narrative histories of TV shows. I really felt like there was a story to be told with Mary and Lou because of all of the female writers in particular behind the scenes. The first show with multiple women writing for it and sharing their own stories for storylines. I love that book, and it got a really good reception. But by the time a couple years later that Seinfeldia came out, I think we were ready even more for this kind of book that takes television seriously, and people just go bananas for Seinfeld. And there seems to be a great overlap between kind of book readers and Seinfeld fans. So that worked really well. And it became a New York Times bestseller. And, I've been talking about it for almost 2 straight years now, still going out, doing events and doing interviews and stuff because people just love it. And I was very excited to tackle Sex and the City after that because to me, I'm very interested in women's stories. I'm interested in women telling their own stories. So Sex and the City is just the logical next step.
Well, it's sort of, there are some other really huge series you could have tackled. You didn't decide to try Murphy Brown, for instance. You didn't try to do Cagney and Lacey, although to some degree Bernie Rosenzweig sort of has that done already.
Right. That is actually a thing. Like I've actually looked into that, and there is some stuff out there about Murphy Brown too, though I think that someone could do that and that it would be good.
Yeah. Diane English definitely needs to. Either she does it in her own voice and at her own pen, or someone needs to work with her on that. So I guess I'll just ask the question, did anything else influence your selection of Sex and the City, whether it was at that time the candidacy of Hillary Clinton or the defeat? Did that influence you at all?
Actually, what's funny about that is that it was the opposite. Like, obviously we were going into the election, but I knew it was happening, and we kind of, Hillary was sort of a foregone conclusion as a candidate. But it was more like I thought, oh, it'll be fine, whatever, the way we all thought the election was going to go. And then when the election happened, I was nervous for a little bit because I thought, God, is this going to seem, stupid and trite and like not that important anymore? We were all very dramatic in those early days right after Trump was elected. And I just thought, oh my God, I don't know if I could do this. And then once I thought about it a little bit, I realized that first of all, it would be great because it is about women telling their own stories. And I think that's important. And it's about empowered women. It's about sexually empowered women. And so I did start to feel like, oh no, actually, this is going to be a really good thing. And this is before, right in between that period of like, the election, and then when we got into the Me Too stuff later. But I was nervous for a bit, and then I decided like, oh no, this is actually going to be great because it's going to be talking about women telling their own stories on television.
Really, there has been an awful lot of conversation that has evolved since November of 2016 to where we are today. A higher sense of openness, a greater understanding that men need to be engaged in some of these conversations. And what better place to start than with the conversation that kind of got a lot of it, that woke up many women throughout America and really throughout the world about everything from feminism and changing roles and sex and satisfaction than Sex and the City. So you tackled the big one. I will just say that, and you did it very well.
Thank you. I do feel like when we were, just when I was having conversations with my editor and publisher and agent and all this, when we were first deciding on this, it seems like, it's almost one of those things where you're like, it's mind boggling how much this show changed everything, you know? I mean, it changed a lot of stuff. And it's always kind of fun and interesting to go back. You almost have to like get in your own mental time machine and go like, wait, what was going on at this time? Why was this such a big deal? And if you remember back to the late 90s, people weren't talking like this. Women weren't talking like this. Women weren't talking about this stuff. And Sex and the City taught us all how to talk about sex with our friends, how to set boundaries with men, how to sort of laugh at it too and say like, you know, every guy doesn't need to be Prince Charming and most of them aren't. You know, it really did open up a lot of these things in addition to its crazy, huge influence on things like fashion and, you know, the economy and things like that.
Yeah. Yes. So I am going to take a page from the book where you give lots of credit to a lot of very people who are influential to the show, opening up to you and sharing some of their experiences. And so the way, listeners, the way that Jennifer really tells all this story is not in a sort of textbooky recitation, direct quotes and all of that. And it's not an oral history that you might, when I think back to that great book on MTV, it's not that either. It's sort of this amalgamation. As you were working through these interviews and maybe starting off with email conversations and then it became a real conversation or whatever, did you get a sense though that hashtag Me Too and hashtag Time's Up, that the great change of the last year and a half, that made people more interested to tell the story and to really give the credit where it was all due?
Yeah, I think so. And something that I've been thinking a lot about is, you know, where does Sex and the City fit in with this whole thing that's been going on? I mean, it's one of the biggest stories of our year and our time, really, the Me Too movement. And it's interesting to think about Sex and the City in this context because, you know, they didn't deal with things like the dangers of sex very often. They didn't deal with sexual assault and harassment that much. There's a few tiny moments that I can pick out, but they really stayed away from it. And I think that was smart in a way for its time because it was trying to tell us the sex was fun and should be embraced by women. So the last thing they needed to be doing was constantly harping on the dangers that were out there, which of course are part of this. But I think instead what they were really doing is kind of demonstrating sex positivity. And those brunch conversations in particular strike me as really those four women kind of figuring out their own boundaries and figuring out what they're into and what they're not into. And this is a huge part of what we need to do and teach women to do going forward, is kind of knowing beforehand, like, here's the stuff I'm interested in. Here's what I'm not interested in. I have to have these boundaries set so that when I'm in a higher pressure situation, I'm ready for that. And I feel empowered. And I think if you have friends like those demonstrated on the show, that can help a lot as well. So there's, they're kind of showing us ways to have these discussions that we still need to be having now.
Mm-hmm. Discussions first and foremost about sex, but also then lots of other philosophy of life. They created opportunities for women to cross the boundaries of talking about money, of talking about death, of their own health, and things that I think women around the world just really needed to understand it was okay to talk about, and no one was gonna think twice for you to start having this conversation with your own circle.
Yeah, I think they showed us kind of this extreme level of intimacy among those four women. Mm-hmm. And like you said, I mean, people people forget a lot about this show. It becomes a caricature kind of in retrospect. It's like, it's about shoes and shopping or whatever, but it's not. There is a whole episode that's about how Carrie is almost broke and her friends help her out in that episode. And, and there is, the absolutely stunning episode in which Miranda's mother dies and her friends kind of become her family, so there's a lot of this stuff that they're discussing. And it's like you said, it's also kind of like health, there's not just the breast cancer, but there are discussions before that, things like vulvodynia that Charlotte struggles with. And, they discuss all of these kind of gynecological issues as well as the fun sex stuff. Like I said, I think the fact that the show was often fun makes people take it less seriously at times.
Yes. And so in her book, Jennifer helps us understand how it is that it came to land on HBO, which by virtue of HBO being a premium cable channel, gave it lots of freedom that otherwise it would never have enjoyed on mainstream, on the broadcast channels. So we can be grateful that it came at a time when, first of all, HBO was willing to take on a project like Sex and the City, and you do a great job of telling that story. But then it was able to push to DVD so quickly that we've never had premium channel in my whole marriage. So, we just don't, if it happens, well, we'll have to wait till it comes out on VHS or DVD. So they pushed it to DVD right away. It has enjoyed so many lives by virtue of the capacity for it to be generated on different platforms, even today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, HBO kind of also has developed this tradition since those times. The Sopranos started at a similar time, and this was really the big moment for HBO. And something that they've managed to do over that time is to kind of make this almost like, it's not like other networks. It's not like, say, NBC with Seinfeld, where of course, NBC loves to remind us that Seinfeld was on there, but it doesn't kind of stay in the family. It gets another distributor for DVD and another it's kind of becomes this piecemeal corporate entity, whereas HBO kind of keeps it all in the family. And so, for instance, they will be also celebrating the 20th anniversary of Sex and the City, and you can still get Sex and the City on HBO Go and also on Amazon and on DVD. And they kind of just make it so that it all stays this one, it's like there's HBO and all of these things come underneath it and they stay with the family. So another funny thing, I mean, this is partly a fluke, but the woman I worked with at HBO for information for the book, she was the actual original publicist for Sex and the City, and she's still there. So, and I used to talk to her when I was at Entertainment Weekly and talking to her about Sex and the City when it was on. So it was such a funny, just go right back to the same person. And yeah, I mean, she has great institutional knowledge as well, but it's like people stay there. They keep taking care of their stars. Sarah Jessica Parker has another show on HBO now, Divorce. So there is this feeling of kind of continuity and a history that I think other networks, just because of the way they were structured, couldn't do.
A little hearkening back to the old studio days of Hollywood, perhaps.
Yeah. And it really does give them, like I said, at this point, they have kind of like a rich history that they can be the caretakers of, instead of it just being, it wouldn't have occurred to me to even try to find a publicist at NBC to talk to about Seinfeld, because it's not there anymore and it's not on television. Whereas this it made sense, and they're still kind of like the keepers of that legacy. And it makes sense for what they do. They were the premier first cable channel to really kind of have that golden age of television.
Yes.
Happening.
Oh my gosh. Well, that in and of itself, that story, I think I want to interview that publicist lady for a future installment of Advanced TV Herstory, because I'm guessing she even has, the authority to tell some of her stories. Oh, fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jennifer Keishin Armstrong is a graduate of the August Northwestern University here in Evanston, Illinois.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So you graduated with a degree in journalism or English or what?
Journalism.
And then you tell a little bit about this part of your life and how it is that it came to influence, how the TV show series Sex and the City came to influence you at this very, kind of developmental time in your life. But with regard now to how it is that you've taken all of your skills in journalism and now are really kind of becoming your own sort of genre or empire with regard to writing these very specific slants on TV shows, because there's so much context and research that goes into it. You're telling a story that to some degree hasn't really been told before. Do you write as you research, Or is this a term paper where you do all your research first and then you organize and then you just start to write? How does that work?
The ideal situation would be that I would do my research, then organize, then write. But especially this one we were on a tight schedule for. I was still promoting Seinfeldia, and the reason we were on the tight schedule is because we wanted to make this 20th anniversary. It just made sense to be out there talking about it at that time. So it was a little bit of a, it was a little more of a crunch. And so with this one in particular, but often with any of these, I start writing with a lot of research done, and then I might still be getting stuff in and sliding it in there as the process continues. I would love it if I had so much time that I could just like do all the research and then write, but that's just not the way this one worked. And furthermore, a lot of times what happens is, you've put out requests or any stuff like that, and then they come back later than you expected. So I had a few interviews that were happening like right at the end where, there was one writer that I had not been able to get in touch with. And then suddenly one of the other writers was like, oh, here's her email. I didn't know you didn't talk to her. It was that kind of thing where, you're just still, and it's like, if somebody's important enough to the story, then I'll still do that. It also eliminates some things. I'm like, okay, well then maybe I don't need to talk to like the fifth key grip or whatever at this point in my research. But if it's one of the major writers, it's like I would still really like to have that. The one that I'm talking about was Amy B. Harris, who started as Darren Starr's assistant and joined the show first that way when he was creating it. And then he kind of very quickly promoted her because she was so helpful during the writing process. And she was also very much like a real life Carrie Bradshaw. Before she worked for him, she had worked at Vanity Fair magazine. It's very fancy. And, she kind of like a lot of media people in New York City who are young, like you're making almost nothing, but then you're being invited to these incredibly fancy parties. And she knew designers and she had access to being able to like borrow clothes or get clothes cheap. And she's beautiful. So she kind of really was living the Carrie Bradshaw life. And I thought like all of those things together made her pretty important to the story. And indeed, I was really glad that I talked to her because she was super helpful and definitely contributed.
As a reader, I would say the parts that revolve around her story and her growth and kind of even her presence in the industry today was really helpful, at least from a TV.
Yeah,
story.
I thought so.
Yeah.
And she's also the one who ended up being in charge of the prequel that they did a couple years ago, the Carrie Diaries on the CW. And they just thought like, oh, she's the perfect person to do this. And I happen to be among the small number of people who watched every episode of that and loved it. So I don't know why it didn't work, but I thought it was delightful. I think there was like a weird disconnect in the marketing or something.
Okay, so we're going to segue a little bit because the backstory, I'm always curious to know the backstory of how it is that an author gets to a point where, as you do, you commit literally years of your life. Sometimes it's only months, but it turns out to be years of your life to the development of the book, the writing of the book, and then ultimately the promotion of the book. And so it is fascinating. And Sex and the City, as sort of the female complement to Seinfeld, is in fact a show that has been vetted and discussed on every forum since the first online forum existed, when we all had dial-up. And so my question is, what did you feel was missing from the conversation about Sex and the City that you needed to create in this book?
There's a couple things. And what's funny is I've actually found, even though I don't realize it's happening, every time I write one of these books, it turns out, no matter how different the shows are from each other, the overall stuff kind of is the same. And I felt the same way about Seinfeld as this, which is that there's a lot of discussion, like you said. And so the challenge is always like, am I going to even be able to contribute anything to this? But first of all, I find that just having the space where I can tell the entire story from start to finish over several hundred pages, that alone ends up being a really special thing because there's all these piecemeal stories out there. Of course, every medium, covered both of these shows multiple times, multiple ways. But being able to tell the whole story, the whole arc from start to finish actually does kind of end up being pretty illuminating if it's an interesting enough story, and both of them are. So getting all the way from really Candace Bushnell, that was something that I was really interested in. Is I feel like while we all know who Candace Bushnell is, I thought that her backstory got lost a lot of the time. We sort of all met her as like, oh, she's the woman who wrote the book that this show is based on anyway. Like that's kind of how that went. And so one of my favorite things in this book was talking to her about living the life of Carrie Bradshaw in real time before she wrote the column, and then the column became a book, and then the book became the show. Like a lot of that was lost. And she's another one where, she kind of proves that despite people's skepticism about Carrie's lifestyle, she was kind of living it. She was broke enough to be sleeping on a friend's sofa bed instead of having her own place. She was writing a column from a friend's apartment, and where she was crashing in the living room, essentially, while also simultaneously like wearing Dolce & Gabbana. It's bananas, but that's what she was doing because she had connections at Vogue. She had connections other places. She had fashion connections. She's beautiful. She's thin. They wanted her to be wearing that stuff. Mm-hmm. So she would go to sample sales. She'd borrow stuff. She'd get stuff. And that's just the life she chose to lead, is like, I'm not going to spend on rent. I'm going to spend on my clothes. And she was clubbing and like out there meeting people all the time. So she really did live that life, and I was interested in that. So I really wanted to tell the whole story all the way from her through now, really, which we still talk about this show all the time. Lots of people still watch it. I talked to a number of young people, 20 and even some a little younger, who are still picking up the show. And so it's like, I really love the idea of being able to tell this story of these shows from the very beginning that's often lost all the way up through now. And the other big thing for me is just how these shows affect actual people. And Sex and the City is possibly the best example of this of all of my books, because this is a show that really, I write in the introduction, the first line of the entire book is I left my fiance for Sex and the City. And obviously there were other factors, but it really was true that this show gave me kind of this vision of my life that I didn't know could exist, that I suddenly went like, oh, what if I just lived in the city and I was alone and I was able to kind of explore adulthood a little more than just settling down with the guy that I met in college. And I don't know if I would have figured that out in time if it weren't for Sex and the City kind of showing me what that would look like and giving me this template to the point where I had just moved to New York City when the show was still on. And I'm not kidding. I really would basically just like watch that show that week and be like, okay, they went to Sushi Samba. Let's go to Sushi Samba. Like I didn't know what else to do, and the internet wasn't that good yet. So that's how my best friend and I at the time, like, a bar would be on that show and we'd be like, all right, we're putting on our much cheaper heels than theirs and we're going to go there. And when you're young, I don't know, we were young and cute because most of us are pretty cute when we're young. And, we were young and cute and thin and like could go places and people would talk to us and let us in. And, we weren't doing the same things that they were, but it felt that way to us. Like just going to get like white wine at a bar while wearing heels felt good enough to us. We were sort of play acting at that. And the thing is, having those role models, like that allows you to kind of have the guts to get out there. Like you kind of say to yourself, I'm Carrie Bradshaw, I'm not me.
Right.
And then you go out on the town and then eventually you do kind of grow into your own version of that. And that to me, I mean, how could any TV show have a bigger effect than that?
Well, I mean, we can hearken over to Gina Davis's organization's hashtag of if she can see it, she can be it. And yes, that's true for everything from, TV characters, women who are in STEM fields or, your favorite forensic anthropologist or law enforcement person. But it also is as we've discussed already, the conversations and the friendships and how it's not just always Roseanne and her sister sitting at the kitchen table of, the Little Rambler, or Walk Up or whatever that is. These conversations happen in lots of different places. And when you're 23, you're more likely to have them, you would like to think, somewhere where there's vitality and you're connecting with the energy of the city. So you were doing what was natural.
Exactly. Right. And I mean, to me, I had just moved to New York City. It's not like, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I wasn't like a country girl, but it was the suburbs. I had a very suburban upbringing and I had a very traditional family. So my parents were together for most of the time, and my dad went to work and my mom stayed home. And I kind of was raised to think like they encouraged me to be my own person and all that stuff. But just seeing that as your main model, I kind of thought like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, is like, even after I go to Northwestern, like, of course I'm going to get a job, but then I also have to like get a husband, and that's going to be my prize. And you settle down with like a good man, and that's what you do. And we were like, my fiance and I at the time, I feel like we're actually play acting at that more than anything else. We were kind of like both in this mode of like, this is what we're supposed to do now. And so we were trying to make it work. And then when we moved to New York City and I sort of saw this Sex and the City lifestyle across the river, we were in New Jersey at the time, I went like, oh, wait, I didn't do that yet. And I would like to. And now I know how because of the show.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot with regard to the show's legacy, because you do a fantastic job of really revealing the level of complexity and strategy that went into building the writing team that delivered the show consistently through all the seasons. And as a matter of fact, listeners, Jennifer and I had a conversation offline about the movies, which we are not going to get into because that's just a sad waste of this podcast. But my only thought on that is that when they were doing the movie is it felt like they took all of the bad story ideas that had never really been developed and they thought, okay, fine, well, we'll just throw them in the movie. And it just felt like that. So anyway, backtracking to my question to you with regard to the legacy of the show is this: writing or fashion? Because is it going to depend in a sense on who that viewer is, and maybe even when it is that they watched it to appreciate. Because I can watch Designing Women and have, I believe that Designing Women's legacy is this fashion time capsule, just like Murphy Brown is. There is just something there, but there was also a richness to the writing of both series. So is it something that it balances, or is in effect, because as you say, Sex and the City changed so much the way we as women talk, that it's the writing? So what do you think?
I think I'll punt a little and say it's both, but I think they're parallel. And I think it's really interesting in a way because it's like there are these women and the two gay men who ran the show, Darren Star and Michael Patrick King. They kind of all were this great unit that turned out to work really well together to bring these stories to life. And like you said, it changed the way we talk. It gave us these phrases in the way that Seinfeld did, right? It gave us things like modelizers or funky spunk. And I do think it's funny, but it's also like a real service in a way, because it giving us those ways of even talking about taboo subjects also, it helps us along so that we can just be like, oh, funky spunk, and everybody gets it instead of having to just, discuss in detail. Or, I was just talking yesterday about Tuchus Lingus. That's one of the discussions they have. That's a pretty, that's pushing the boundaries of definitely anything that's been on television before. Or, Mrs. Up the Butt from the first season. So they gave us these ways of talking about things. I do think also that Patricia Field, who did the fashion, is a singular genius. I mean, there's very few other people who have worked, especially in television, who did what she did. And particularly with the show. Now you can kind of like, if you watch, for instance, the show Younger that Darren Stark is currently doing, she does fashion there and you can see that. But this was like mind blowing when she first was doing this on Sex and the City. I mean, I talk about in the book how there were even discussions on set at times, especially early on, where everyone was like, why is she wearing a Heidi dress? Like, this is a little much right now. But if you look at what's going on in fashion now, it kind of it has roots in what she did, like the main thing being, I think she made Carrie Bradshaw a street style star before that was a thing. And she really dressed them for fashion instead of for men. And those two things, I can see sort of almost parallels between the way the writing worked, which was, we're a show about sex, but we're not a show about sex for men. We're a show about sex for women. We talk about it. This is from the women's point of view. This is not about titillation. This is about really bringing this out into the open. And similarly, she kind of dressed, especially Carrie, not for men who might watch, but for women who are watching, and to kind of go like, whoa, that's really pushing the boundaries. And some of there was some crazy stuff on there, but that was the point, is that of course most of us aren't going to wear that in real life. But she gave us kind of this broader vision of what we could be dressing like. And it really spread across the country. That was the other part of this. It took it way far beyond the coastal cities where fashion tended to happen before. And she made household names out of Manolo Blahnik. Like, no one knew who Manolo Blahnik was except the fashion elite before the show. And now it's like you can go to a mall in Ohio and somebody's going to know who Manolo Blahnik is. So that's big. It really is. I mean, my sister was one of the people I interviewed for my book, my younger sister, and she's a costumer now for television. And she talks about how she's like, at the time, we didn't really have the fashion blogs that we have now. So she was like, it was either Vogue or this show. Like, she's like, I watched the show to find out what was going on in fashion. She was sneaking downstairs to watch the show, not because she cared about the sex, but because she wanted to see what Patricia Field was up to that week. And, that's a huge influence.
And because this was the late 90s, this was before, this was back when stores were still stores. I mean, back when men were men and stores were stores. Yeah. And so you knew what you could have. You didn't know what you couldn't have.
Exactly it. That's exactly it. And, girls like my sister, who was definitely more fashion forward than I ever was, she would do things like she'd watch this show and she'd look at Vogue and then she'd wear this stuff. And all of her Midwestern high school friends were like, what are you? Like, they would basically make fun of her. I mean, she was fine, but like, you know what I mean? Like, even something like Uggs, which totally was not a Sex and the City thing, even something dumb like that, when she first started wearing them, it was before everybody else. And they were like, why are you wearing those stupid boots? And then like a year later, everyone's wearing them. So that's what it was like when she would show up and wear like the flower, the fabric flower, or, she like made her own shoes that were like Carrie Bradshaw's, and people would be like, what are you doing? And then they'd be like, oh my God, it was so cool. It was on Sex and the City, so it did have this incredible influence. And I think it really showed women different ways of dressing besides just you're either like,
yeah, no, totally
wearing sexy stuff, traditionally sexy, short skirts, whatever, or you're wearing like your power suit office, which is what they were always showing women in, especially in the 90s on television. It was all just like the power bitch suits and that sort of thing.
So let's call those the strongest legacies of the show. But there were also some areas where both the series earned good marks and it also kind of got some Fs. And so you touch on this throughout. Certain aspects of the show just were very, very exclusive in terms of the diversity of even the supporting and the cameos and the little tiny roles. There was not a lot of diversity of body size or skin tone. And while the conversation about sex and death and money and sex from a women's perspective certainly is universal, it's kind of universal to the gender, I would expect. It was really only came through from a rather privileged white voice.
For sure.
When you were interviewing some of these people, whether they were behind the scenes or writers or in fact performers, did they just sort of bow their heads and and try not to think about it? Or
yeah. It's always hard to talk about this stuff because I talked about it with regard to Seinfeld as well. These shows came late enough that we knew better, and the discussion did come up during the time that they were on the air. However, it was still this weird time where like we would talk about that and they'd get criticism for it, and then everyone would be like, oh, well, you know what I mean? Like it was this very strange time. And it's only pretty recent that they really started to make change in television, and they'll say lots of stuff behind the scenes about how like audiences don't want to see people of color, that kind of, that's the kind of excuses they used to make.
Oh yeah. Like little kids don't want a Monopoly game of Star Wars that has Rey as a character. No, they...
Exactly. Like it's really just that they're always historically so scared to do anything that hasn't already been proven to work. Therefore, nobody makes any changes. Yeah. So it really wasn't until like Shonda Rhimes era that we started, because she just came in and she was like, look, this is how it's going to be. And it was a giant success. So I don't want to make excuses for them, of course. It would have been better if they had remedied the situation. And let's face it, especially by the end, they were going into the 2000s. They were on until 2004. So it's like, definitely by the end, the chorus became fairly deafening that like, oh my God, why are there no people of color in New York City on this, for a show about New York City so specifically. And like you said, we didn't even see maybe background, but beyond background, we really didn't see that much, and maybe not even that much background. And what also ended up happening, and it shows how important it is to have people with different perspectives making the stuff. You know what I mean? Like that's why we're always harping on this, is because what we saw was that the times that this show would try to address, I'm just going to go for the race one because that one's just such an egregious situation, and it was one much discussed. When they go to decide like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have Samantha date a black man. It ends up being this incredibly clunky.
And Miranda date a black man. Yeah. Yeah.
And Miranda by the end, she got the like one token at the very end, like super hot, like probably the hottest guy that's been on that show, Blair Underwood. Hottest and most perfect boyfriend, in my opinion, on that show. Like I get that the part of the point was that he was perfect, but you're just like, oh, Miranda, come on. And then she's like, I'll pick Steve. I get it.
Love is love. Penny, Miranda, go back.
Yeah, it felt so, both of those instances, even the better one, which was the Blair Underwood one, they both felt so token by the time they did them. And they were so clunky because white people tend to be pretty awkward around the subject of race. Awkward and ignorant, and even it's still today, and definitely probably even more so then, that the earlier episode in which there, we have a lot of one episode boyfriends, right? And we have a one episode boyfriend for Samantha, who is black. It just didn't work well in the way that they tend to approach these one-off boyfriends. It maybe needed more. Maybe it needed a couple episodes to really get into it, but it ends up kind of making a false equivalence between sillier relationship problems that the other women are having, right? Like Charlotte is dating a guy who isn't a good kisser. And also, like, Samantha is dealing with the entire, history of racial relations in America with her date. But in the end, they kind of end up trivializing it. And there are a million other problems in that episode. But that to me was that was why it would have worked better if they actually had people of color behind the scenes making the stuff. They would know how to do this a little better. So that, I think it started from there.
Which is the same the same argument that can be made for why it is that the LGBT community came through as being such a, I don't want to use the term beneficiary, but the LGBT community and its reputation and the understanding that we grew to have of how gays and lesbians factor into our lives, and transsexuals because of living in the meatpacking district, as Samantha did. I mean, there was a lot of exposure. There was a lot of familiarity, and they were all very wonderful human people, all of these characters. And lo and behold, it was partly because the two strongest influences on the series were gay men. So, yeah, it kind of goes to show you that you're going to get a stronger character and a more inclusive series if that's what your writer's room and your developer circles look like.
Exactly. I mean, they did such a wonderful job with women, because we had two gay men running the show, but all women other than them. Like that at that time still, and maybe even now, just recently it wouldn't be as extraordinary. But like having an all-female writer's room except for the showrunner was extraordinary in itself. And they were all, as I talk a lot about in the book, they were all telling, so, they would just like go out and date the night before, bring back some stories for the next day at work, like that's why those felt right. Whereas, when we got into the characters of color, it just did not work. And yeah, like you said, it one thing they did really well was kind of expose, I think, a larger audience to gay culture in New York City. And you can see how that sort of had this outward effect. And we eventually, Will and Grace is around the same time as well. And people started to just sort of like embrace these parts of gay culture into the mainstream.
And yeah, exactly. Okay. So those were either intentional consequences or intentional impact and legacy and just this broader way that, to your point early on, this was a series that really truly changed America and all of the international worldwide viewers who have enjoyed it a gazillion times over. There were some other sort of unintentional influences or consequences from the show, one of which was every strand of economic development. I mean, it created so many different markets for so many different things. And it's sort of like Oprah's book club to the degree that once something was stated on the show, or like you said, a bar that was featured, you were within walking distance or a short train ride to that bar. People in, Illinois and Minnesota weren't. How did the show really have such an economic influence? And what were some of the stories that you tell in the book?
It's crazy, right? Like, this is one of the shows, I would say it really created its whole own economic ecosystem. It's like that continues, which is also mind-boggling. So it's, one of the greatest illustrations of this, I think, is the cupcake craze, because it's so specific and unlikely and cannot be attributed to anything else in the world except that. Anything else, you're like, maybe, women were kind of ready for higher fashion anyway, or, that, or the internet was opening that up anyway. Whereas like cupcakes, there's no explanation for except Sex and the City. End of story. And everybody I talk to agrees with this in terms of business. So, this was something like 30 seconds on the show where they showed Miranda and Carrie eating cupcakes in front of Magnolia Bakery in the West Village, and ended up just starting this massive trend. First, it was most obvious when people were lining up around the block right away in the West Village to get specifically Magnolia cupcakes. But then there was sort of this proliferation of other cupcake places, first in New York City and then across the country and then around the world. And eventually, Magnolia was, you can imagine, bought out by a bigger investor who could kind of take it national and then worldwide. And when I talked to him about this, first of all, I can tell you specifically, he said he wanted this bakery because this was the bakery from Sex and the City. He was like, I watched it with my wife. I understood the potential. And so that was why he invested. That's why he bought it. And he really felt like it could be so much bigger. And he was right. So he expanded it nationwide and eventually took it to all kinds of places across the world. And one of the things that he said that struck me that was so interesting is that he said, you know, okay, in America, like there are other factors at play. Like we grew up eating cupcakes, so they have a nostalgia factor for us. We like that they're small, so that it feels like you're eating fewer calories. Like there are other, they're portable, but places like Asia, like basically any big Asian market that they're in, he's like, they don't even know about cupcakes except for Sex and the City. Like that's how they found out about them. They didn't grow up having them in their classrooms. So for them, the whole reason that they're eating cupcakes is just Sex and the City. And what else is really interesting about the cupcakes, I think, is a point that's made about a couple of trends that happened because of Sex and the City, but people were kind of at first floored by their sort of like hugeness. So it's like cupcakes, Cosmos, those are the two big ones. And then to a lesser extent, like the flower, do you remember there was a whole season where she would wear like the fabric flower on her person at some point at all times, that was her accessory of the moment. And everybody was really taken aback by the fervor with which fans embraced these particular trends. And there's one common theme among them, which is that they are accessible and affordable. So while we all learned instantly what Manolos were, we could not. I have yet to buy my first pair of Manolos. I've looked and then I've been like, oh, or I could do so many other things with that money, you know? But these are the things where you could kind of feel for a minute like you were Carrie Bradshaw without having to spend $500 that you didn't have. So that's sort of the idea behind a lot of these that were really embraced, is that it seems like they were the ones that people could really get into. And the flower took, you know, even like Patricia Field by surprise. And then they realized like, oh, of course, you know, that's the one my sister even talked about, that she was a teenager in Homer Glen, Illinois. And she was able to go to like Target and buy a fabric flower at least, you know, and she could like make things with her fabric flowers then and accessorize herself. So that is, you know, so that it kind of like really created these little pockets of economic activity. And then the bigger ones, as we've talked about, the big fashion ones as well, are also significant. But this really showed how this show is endlessly marketable. There's something about, as shown by my own story, there's something about these women that makes us want to be like them. And when you can find these concrete ways of doing that, when there's something specific you can wear or eat or a place you can go, that feels significant to people. And it's also why I, you know, in the same chapter about economic activity, I talk a lot about the famous Sex and the City bus tour in New York City. And that too is really just capitalizing on that, because they just take you to all the places from Sex and the City. Why I've yet to come up with a great explanation in general of why we love to go to the places that our favorite TV characters supposedly went, but probably didn't even a lot of the time.
That's huge. That's
People love it.
Final context. Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. It makes you, it's like, it's so hard. You know, you're never going to know these people in real life because they're not real. So the one way you can kind of make it real for yourself is to go to these places. And it's clear, like, you know, there's all these bus tours of New York City of all different, you know, movie sites and Seinfeld sites and everything else. But the Sex and the City one is special. Like, it became more famous. It's sort of a caricature. It's something that people, honestly, when I tell people that I'm writing, that I was working on this book, a lot of people mention the bus tour. They're like, they kind of joke like, oh, did you go on the bus tour? And I'm like, of course I did. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, that like was one of the first things I did for research is that tour. And I totally recommend it. I love it. It's really, really fun. And especially as a jaded New Yorker, if you can just like drop all of your cynicism and just bask in the like fluffy silliness of it all, it's very, very fun. They give you cupcakes and Cosmos on that tour.
Well, it's a self-selected group of people who want to celebrate a TV series that was as woman-centric as we will ever see in our lifetime. So there's nothing to be that in and of itself as a point of capitalism should be celebrated, I think.
I agree. I mean, you're right. If we really think about what's happening there, that's really special. There's always like two guys on the tour and the tour guide's like, oh, sorry, you had to be on this tour, blah, blah, like they always make jokes. But yeah, it's a bus full of women.
Reliving. Yeah.
Just being like, hey, we're women.
It's like going to a women's basketball game. It's a different experience. So
that's exactly how I'm going to think about it from now on. It's like going to a women's basketball game.
Which are very fun. There's nothing better than watching 60-year-old women finally get to unleash and enthusiastically follow a game and cheer. And they just cheer.
I love that.
It's very cool. I recommend. Okay. a bit of a somber shift because this was a series so set in New York, or as you say, was fashion the fifth woman, or was the city the fifth woman? But it aired through 9/11, and depending upon your DVD or is the Twin Towers are in every intro, even after 9/11, or did they take them down? I can't remember.
They took them out after 9/11, but they were obviously, they do a bunch of those shots of buildings, of iconic buildings in New York City. So that was one of the biggest changes that they made after 9/11, and also made zero other changes to those opening credits the rest of the time. And they would have left it alone if it weren't for 9/11. I mean, those are iconic opening credits, if there ever were any. And they just changed that, I want to say, to the Chrysler Building. It's strangely enough, it's also the shot where they show Sarah Jessica Parker's name. So they felt weird about that after 9/11. Yeah.
But so my DVDs from seasons 1, 2, and 3, or whatever, 1 and 2 at least, have them. Anyway, that's only half my question regarding 9/11. As you had interviews with everybody who was so influential in the show, who accommodated you, and kudos to you for getting people who are very busy and involved with lots of projects to kind of sit down and go through what they think they've said 1,000 times. But I'm sure that the areas you took off in were probably, I would like to think, left them thinking, yeah, there is still so much more to all this. But discuss a little bit about the tone and kind of how the producers had to take the tone of the show and the timing of when 9/11 happened, and the series because I would say that the series timing and the movie's timing sometimes were probably some of the worst aspects. It was like if Karma was going to dump on a series, that one kind of.
That's so true. I hadn't thought of it because it's like the market crashed right before Sex and the City too. Yeah, absolutely. So if nothing else, they have great resilience, right? Because we're still here talking about them. The 9/11 stuff is so interesting to me. I mean, I don't think it's just because I moved to New York City right around that time. I moved to New York City 10 days after 9/11. And so I feel really strongly about the episodes that they did kind of around it, because they somehow really managed to reflect the mood without getting too deep into, commentary on 9/11 or anything. So a couple things are really interesting. One is that the show had just naturally taken a more serious turn kind of right before that. So, it started out as kind of these frivolous date of the week kind of things, and it's just sort of silly. And this was when they really started to get deep, right? It's like, Charlotte marries Trey, even though he's impotent, and then she's dealing with kind of figuring out that her Prince Charming is not her Prince Charming and that that's not real. Miranda's kind of going back and forth with Steve, and she eventually gets pregnant with his child. Big and Carrie have their affair. It's an actual, like an extramarital affair where he is cheating on his wife and she is cheating on Aiden. So things got super serious all of a sudden in general. And that turned out to be, I want to say it kind of helped in terms of the transition, because it wasn't as if they went from one minute just making jokes about Tuchus Lingus immediately into like this serious time. So that's the first part. And then the second part that's very interesting is that they had shot, I want to say 9 episodes, and they were done, and they finished a couple weeks before 9/11, that they had written and shot these, and they're going to run the following January. And so then they end up having a bunch of these episodes. You can't just, I mean, this is a lot of money. You can't just scrap 9 episodes of a show that's this expensive. But they got lucky is a weird way of saying it. But what it turned out, because the show was taking this more serious turn anyway, naturally, and they had turned out to just coincidentally write some of their most poignant episodes specifically about New York City, that it worked. And so they did take some things out. You know, they changed the credits. There was one scene where Samantha dances with her love interest, Richard Wright, on a rooftop. And there, originally that had the Twin Towers in the background. They were able to digitally erase that. And other than that, they didn't really have to make a lot of changes. And then the kicker was the fact that the very last episode in that pod is the one named I Heart New York. And it was named that before 9/11. And it very weirdly had a shot of a snow globe with the Twin Towers in it. And there's this like very sort of serious, poignant voiceover bit that Carrie does at the very end of that episode. This is the one where Big moves away from New York. He moves to Napa. And so they have this beautiful, perfect, classic New York date. So they're kind of celebrating everything that's great about New York. They go on a carriage ride, all of this stuff. And then she has this voiceover that's about seasons change, and so do cities, and so do people. And it's good to know that you always, even you always have a friend, even though they're just a plane ride away or something like that.
Sure.
It's really, really weird that they would have all this in there, but it was in the original. And so that was just a pure stroke of like fate, that they seemed like they were addressing it in this understated, tasteful way, when in fact they had just written a thing that resonated afterwards. So that really worked. And then by the time they were coming back for the next season, things had kind of like, we sort of had started to get our bearings again after 9/11. And so they kind of knew better then which jokes you could make and which you couldn't. And they did just enough with, I think they did a pretty good job of like, the very next episode back was the one where the women enjoy Fleet Week. They flirt with sailors during Fleet Week. And so it has this patriotic element, but it's still very Sex and the City. And they kind of recovered after that. It's a little bumpy, and that was a strange time for them overall. It's like also when Sarah Jessica Parker got pregnant. And so that's when Carrie suddenly gets very into wearing tent dresses all of the time. And, so it was just like a weird period for them overall, but I think they ended up handling it really nicely and tastefully, which I don't think is something everyone expected of them. That's how I would say it, is like I said, the show was constantly underestimated. And I think people were ready to kind of tear into them if they did it wrong, because as I talk about in the book, the show had savage critics throughout. I mean, really mean, not just like, I like it, I don't like it. People had it out for the show. A lot of male critics in particular had it out for the show. So they would have taken a lot of heat if they did it wrong. And they really ended up doing a beautiful job.
Okay. So listeners, if you somehow weren't paying attention in the first part of this podcast, we are speaking with Jennifer Keishin Armstrong about her book, Sex and the City and Us, which is yet another in a string of fascinating deep dives into the TV series that have really changed certainly American culture, American viewers and their lives, impacted them in ways that were somewhat reflective of the time, but also continue to remind us how it is that we start. Then we get influenced by something like art, which TV is, and the women of TV in particular, their voices, their writing, their fashion. And these conversations, we Jennifer and I really could go on and on and on and on. There is just, so there's a little addendum that I want to do before we kind of head into the close here. And that is because everything is filled with layers. And in the book, you certainly discuss the ongoing whisper campaign that had gone on about whether or not there was in fact a feud or a conflict between SJP and Kim Cattrall. And, it kind of brought to mind, and I get crabby about this because this is just the tabloids. This is, if we didn't have social media, particularly today, we would have the National Enquirer the way we did 30 years ago. And they would be the only ones trying to keep this fire fanned, right? Because they're the only ones who make money on whether or not two women who are professionals and very visible in their professions and very successful, whether or not they like each other. It boggles my mind. And it took me back to the great FX TV series of earlier last year, Feud, the Joan Crawford and Bette Davis story. So that's my little kind of ranty thing. But, do you get that same sense? And do these women get that same sense? Is this just crazy?
Yes. I mean, that's the short version. And, when I very first started writing this book, I didn't particularly have any intention of diving into that. I knew it was out there, but I kind of felt like you were saying. And the one thing I was interested in, though, is I did get very interested in the media treatment of these women. And another great example of this is I quote one of the worst reviews early on of the show that just in which Tom Shales of the Washington Post says the meanest things possible about Sarah Jessica Parker's appearance. It's so crazy. People just had it, like I said, they had it out for the show, and they certainly had it out for these women. And I don't think it takes a detective to figure out why. This is a show about empowered women. So let's figure out how to disempower them. Let's figure out how to make this a trivialized thing. And yes, I think, it's entirely possible, probable, especially given now public evidence, unfortunately, in recent months, that SJP and Kim Cattrall maybe did not get along that well, did not mesh on a personal level. But a lot of us have worked with people in our lives that we didn't necessarily want to hang out with on the weekends or after we were done working with them. And it's only the constant media insistence upon these two women being best friends that makes it into a feud, if that makes any sense. And I can see how you'd sort of crack under that eventually and get annoyed, because you would just be like, oh my God, that's enough. Why do you keep making us try to be something that we're just not? We all can acknowledge that this is fiction. This is a fictional show. I'm sorry to tell you all that Carrie Bradshaw and Samantha are not real, and that these women are actresses and they're really good. And so they were able to portray important stories in our lives to us while maintaining entirely separate identities as real people. So that is very frustrating to me. And I think it's only this kind of like you said, if you ask about it enough times, they're going to get annoyed. And it just fuels it, like you said. So I did get into it a little bit because I felt like we had to talk about, people still talk about it and it's huge. It's been in the news again. And so I was like, all right, we have to talk about this. And I kind of decided I wanted to figure out where it came from originally. And so I really dug around in newspapers and stuff. And I think I found close to patient zero or nearabouts. And I think the second or third season was when it first sort of the rumblings were starting that that Sarah Jessica felt threatened by the way that kind of Kim Cattrall became this huge star because of the show, because it's such a scene-stealing role and so important. It's an iconic role, and because she represents everything we're talking about. She is the most sexually liberated.
Is the alpha.
Yeah. She's the one. I think I have somebody quoted in there saying she's the leader of the rebellion, and she was so good at the role that there were these reports that Sarah Jessica felt like she was supposed to be the star, and then she was mad at Kim Cattrall. And so these just kind of rumblings stayed throughout everything. And what happens with this kind of story is that it makes everybody see it through that lens, whether it's true or not. So later on, for instance, when Kim Cattrall was trying to demand more money for the first movie, it was seen through this lens of, is this the feud? When in fact, it seems great. Like this is all we talk about now, is how women should be asking for more. So it's very frustrating. And I can tell you one thing I can definitely tell you with confidence is that it has really frustrated Sarah Jessica. Like you can tell, when you're talking to a person, like you can tell when it's real emotion. I know she's an actress, but like you can tell. And she was like, why is it like, the thing they kept saying, and it's really true, is she was like, no one ever asked James Gandolfini why he wasn't hanging out with Nancy Marchand on the weekends, which I love that example. But she's right. Like they weren't saying, and what's funny is, the guys in The Sopranos are portrayed as being quote unquote friends, but nobody was like, where are they? And did they get each other birthday presents and whatever? Like it's bizarre.
And nobody's tracking whether, Jerry Seinfeld and George Costanza, who played George. Yeah.
Jason Alexander. No, we talked about that one too. Like that's a really good example because that was a show about friendship as well. And like no one is tracking their every movement and every social media post to see for clues about this. There is something very specific and emotional and primal for people about conflict between women. And it is exactly what they want to see because the show portrays the opposite. The show portrays that these women are kind of ride or die for each other. And, they want to put cracks in that. And I hate doing the they, but, it's true. Like you said, the tabloids and gossip sites sell based on this stuff. So,
yes. So our call to action, Jennifer, you in New York, me in Chicago here, our call to action, sisterhood, listenerhood, men who are listening to this show is do not take the clickbait.
Yes.
Do not.
Yes.
If it's what's going on, what's the latest, who tweeted what, no, don't go there. Ignore it. Just keep walking.
Exactly.
If it's on the front of People magazine, and even though People magazine wants Sarah Jessica Parker to tell her story, don't buy it. Let it die. Let it go away. Let these people live their lives as they want to live them and not through these filters that are trying to make money and perpetuate a feud. And the feud that, as you just said, is a formula of how to take strong women and turn them against each other.
Exactly. And it's too bad because I think like, let's just talk about the legacy of the show. It's like, let's just talk about what the show did for women instead of who's doing what now. And, and it's like, it's gotten pretty silly. So,
yes. Okay. Well, I had to get that off my chest.
No, it's been a big, it's another one of those things where when I tell people I have a book coming out about Sex in the City, that's one of the first things people ask me about.
So just say no, keep walking. There's nothing to say. All right. Oh my gosh. Well, we could just talk all day long, but we aren't going to. But we would certainly encourage any listener of this episode to go back to the Mary Tyler Moore episodes that we produced these 2 years ago. Also to go out and after the first part of June buy Jennifer's book, Sex and the City and Us, or pre-order it. So Jennifer, give us a little information on how someone can go ahead and get in line for a cupcake and a book.
I don't know about cupcakes, but yeah, absolutely. It's already available for pre-order and you can take care of that right now online and it will be available, as they say, anywhere books are sold, June 5th.
Cool. And let's see, you are somewhat visible on social media, accepting and retweeting when appropriate. How does someone find you on Twitter?
JMK Armstrong.
That's your Twitter handle? Well, I guess it is.
It is.
Well, I guess it's good. It's vanilla enough that you can transition from, being the expert on Mary to being the expert on Seinfeld. And now that's
the thing. Yes. It has to be my name.
Yes. And you have a website still, right?
I do. JenniferKArmstrong.com.
All right. Well, I'm going to roll some credits here as we give like the most enthusiastic thanks and cheers and all of it to Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, as we just look forward to lots of good promotion and publicity and opportunity for you to celebrate Sex and the City and us, and to teach and remind America how important this series was and still is today. And every time I say America, and I'm like, no, this was worldwide. And you go to great lengths in your book to really explain the international impact that this series had. And there is nothing. This entire series is just full of superlatives. So pardon my gushing. But I will gush because I have to thank Jen Eads for who is our new editor on the show. David Brown, who has been the longtime audio editor of the series, is now going to be working on some video projects with me. So we are going to be having a stronger video presence at our website, tvherstory.com, as well as on Facebook, and just popping up in places. This show can actually be streamed on YouTube. If you know of it, listeners, if you have an elderly person in your life who would want to talk about Sex and the City or listen to us talk about it, and the only thing they can do is pull up YouTube, then there's actually this channel that they can do that at. Sometimes on the iPad, that's just the most efficient way to handle it. But anyway, so Jen Eads is now our editor. And as you think about the ways that Sex and the City influenced your life or has made a difference perhaps to others in your family or in your circle, do send me a note at Advanced TV Herstory, that's all one word, at gmail.com. Find this podcast and all of its opinions and promotions on Twitter at TV Herstory. And we are now to a point where, yes, we've grown up as a podcast. We are now going to great lengths to make sure that we are dropping an episode every other Thursday morning. So yes, it is all regular, and we are we're buckling in and instilling great discipline. And finally, with regard to great discipline, and it is only because I want the best for this show that the series, this show, Advanced TV Herstory, has developed a Patreon account. So if you go to patreon.com and you search for the podcast Advanced TV Herstory, you can make just a modest donation to this show, so that really bottom line is that I can get more people working on it to do the work necessary to spread the good word about the episodes that we've done in the past, as well as do what I can to bring on high quality, great guests like Jennifer Keishin Armstrong in the future. It all takes time. It takes a lot of background and a lot of technology that just exhausts me. So patreon.com, Advanced TV Herstory. Your support always is appreciated in whatever form it comes. The richness of putting on this podcast is not lost on me. The great gifts that I have received and the blessings, and one is getting to know just the inimitable force of Jennifer Keishin Armstrong. So I'm thrilled that you are with us today, and look forward to many more in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks much for listening. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.